I'm glad we had this little discussion about language because I do find it's an ongoing conversation about language, and I do find it limiting for myself as well because I write in English, but sometimes I'm thinking in Bangla, and then I can't always find um, it satisfying enough to be able to only write in one language.
One very interesting thing has happened with English is that with the OTT space sort of taking over cinema watching in the last 5 to 8 years across the world, people are now across the world, across cultures, they are much more attuned to watching a film in a language they don't understand because of subtitles.
Yes.
So, given that I am a subtitle writer, a lot of my bills in my early years in Bombay were paid writing subtitles. I write all my subtitles. So, I write them also in a way where I transcreate the cultural context. I don't literally translate, because then that subtitle is used as a base by 65 to 70 other countries to translate into their language subtitles. So somewhere the audio experience of hearing the language is not compromised. You have subtitles. So it's complex, but somewhere watching films on devices has brought this, which actually literature always had. Like, we've all read Murakami and Marquez in translation, but we've never really watched a film in translation until the last few years and been okay with it because it's become now a very acceptable cultural thing to do.
This is very true, and it's almost like a preferred way of watching it with subtitles. Even if you can understand the language, sometimes you like to have the subtitles as well.
This wasn't the case 10 years ago because subtitles would bother you. But now we've gotten used to it because this speed at which we read and then go back to the image, we've sort of gotten trained.
We've been trained to do that. I want to talk to you though a little bit about these two different sort of formats, which is your full-length features and the short films, and what the short films allow you to do, and what are the things that are a little bit different when you're thinking about doing shorts, and if you can talk a little bit about the short films that you've done.
I don't know, this will take me 4 steps back to talk about the fact that I would never have made short films if for nearly 10 years my feature films weren't getting made. So I had 16 or 17 features start and stop and get shot and never release, and just so many features that I've seen hit the dirt and never really rise again from the ashes, that I got compelled to make shorts the minute I got a chance because I was filled with stories and no way to put them out. So much so that by my first really viral short, a 5-minute film called Elaichi, was actually conceived as a web series in 2006. Then I reconceived it as a feature film 4 years after the web series didn't get made. So finally, when India had a bit of a phase in 2014, 15, 16, where short films were going viral on YouTube. And I happened to suddenly become the demigod of short films. I didn't even plan it. When the boom happened, I was just ready with 150 stories. And I'm like, whoever's throwing an opportunity at me, I have a story for the opportunity. And I made 5 short films back to back in that 1 year. And they all went viral. Elaichi, Ugly Bar, Tandav, and that changed my game, and that led to Ajji and Bhosle and Joram. So I don't know if I approached them differently, or I don't know. I wouldn't have made shorts if my features didn't get made. So every other medium that I've explored, it's because the previous medium got thwarted. So it's been an accidental journey. So when people ask me who don't know my journey and they say that, so you made shorts before you made features, I said, no, I made 17 unfinished features before I had to consider making shorts, but I'm grateful I did because shorts really set me up as a storyteller. But I don't know, maybe the journey would have played out very differently.
I find like each one of your shorts is so different though from each other.
Like I said, I had so many stories inside me, and all of those opportunities came very differently. They came from different quarters. So people wanted different things from me, and I had 150 stories. I'm like, whatever opportunity you have for me, I open my coat like a traveling salesman, and I'm like, I got this, I got this, I got this. Whatever works for you, I'll make it. Literally, like Pandav, it was Manoj and I were trying to make Bhosle since 2014. It got set up 4 times and got shelved 4 times. So finally, when 3 of my shots went viral, he said, "Why don't we make a shot together?" I'm like, "Okay, opportunity." I went back home, wrote Tandav in 12 hours because I
Wow.
had material inside me. For years, I didn't know what they would become. If Tandav didn't become a short film, it would be a short story in forgetting, or it would be something else. I don't know what. So it was just that. It was just them finding their way out given the opportunity.
But I find like, for instance, Ugly Bar, I recently saw it again. And that's just a timeless little short film. And I think it becomes even more chilling every time I watch it, just given where we're going.
I wish it wasn't timeless and I wish it felt dated, but every year it feels like it was made
Even more,
today.
absolutely. It felt even more relevant. So I would really encourage people who haven't seen it to watch that film, because that's just one of those things that it will not leave you. It will not leave.
Interestingly, in 2015, when I made it, and I shot it exactly a year since the BJP came to power. I shot it in May 2015. And a lot of people who saw it. So if you note, the killer in that film has a tilak, and all the 3 people who get killed have Muslim names. And multiple people, multiple means at least 70% of the audience, then they were like, isn't this a little too one-sided? And why does he have to have a tilak? Even without a tilak, it still works. Why do you have to bring religion into this? I'm like, because you don't know what is happening, and you will eventually know. And now I'm seen as a prophet. They're like, you were ahead of your time. I'm like, no, it was happening. You just chose not to see it. Now it's happening in your neighborhood, so you know that it's happening.
You didn't choose to put it there. It was there, so you put it in. It was there already.
Yeah.
Shall we talk a little bit about what you briefly touched upon? Who is allowed to tell what stories? And this whole thing of appropriation. And I also want to talk a little bit about political correctness and wokeness. And where do you see someone who wants to be unfettered in their expression? Where do you see the pitfalls, and where do you see, in your case at least, do you see it hampering you in any way, having to adhere to politically correct? Because I find even within the, say, liberal landscape, there are fractures, and it's not a monolith, right? It's not there are differences, and increasingly it is becoming very hard to hold on to any difference that doesn't absolutely go one way or the other.
I don't know. This is a very, very difficult. It's a minefield. Every step we take, there'll be a landmine blowing up. You lose a finger, lose a toe.
Have to talk no bit about it. I mean,
Of
we can't.
course, of course. And I'm made to talk about it so often that I now I'm starting to feel that maybe I won't have anything left to put in my stories because this is so exhausting every time it comes up because it's necessary. It's a very polarizing and very woke and very volatile time where although the governments in most countries are becoming that much more oppressive and fascist, technology and the internet is also allowing a lot many more kinds of voices to bubble up to the surface and be heard. So it's a although it's difficult for someone who is like when I'm talking on behalf of like I had a story that was mm, a lesbian love story, and I've been trying to set it up for the last 4 years, and and almost every producer or studio or international producer that I spoke to or sales agent, they're like, "Are you gay?" I'm like, "I'm not." "Do you have an LGBTQ co-writer?" I said, "No." "Are you going to have someone who's, I mean, are you going to have lead actors who are definitely going to be LGBTQ?" And I'm like, I write very complicated stories, and there's going to be so much complexity in the characters that I need uh, very professionally trained and very, very good actors. Now, If I find a really good LGBTQ actor, yes. But if I don't, I'm not going to not make my film because I didn't find the right LGBTQ actor. So, like, so your film should not be made because you are not the right representative of that voice, and you are therefore appropriating, and all of those words start coming at me. I've been trying to set up that film for 5 years and I've not been able to. So it's yes, it's a little becomes a little difficult for me, but I get it, and that makes it even more difficult for me. I get the fact that suddenly in the history, I'll speak for India. I won't speak for the world because I don't know at what point in Germany or what point in Switzerland people became woke. But I do know that in India it happened at a certain time. I was telling stories for the last 15 years, and we were not woke when I started telling stories. We became woke at some point in my journey when my films actually started getting made, and suddenly I was hit by this roadblock because I had chosen very early on to tell stories of people who are voiceless, choiceless, marginalized. I don't like using these words either because even these words are sort of appropriation, because who are we sitting in the center of the things that we decided are the main constitute the mainstream, and saying that that person on the periphery is marginalized. So, but I don't have a better way to simplify this, so I'm using those words. So I don't know where I place myself in this debate, because despite that, I still make a Joram where Manoj Bajpayee, who's not remotely a tribal, is playing a tribal. And yes, I have a lot of tribal actors in the film, but they're not playing the primary roles. They're in the secondary and tertiary roles. So how am I going to answer when put in the dock? I don't know. The only answer I have always is that I'm not making the film for people who are already from that set of people. I'm making it for the people who are not sensitized enough to their situation. So for
But
that,
they,
yeah,
if you're telling children, you can write any story you want. You can be a fire truck, you can be a tree, you can be a bird, and you can write in the voice of whatever. And that is what is imagination, and that is what is inhabiting something you're not. And then suddenly these children are going to grow up and we're going to be like, you can only write stories, fiction stories. I'm not saying you can make documentaries kind of appropriating someone else's, but you can only write even fiction only about the world that you have had prior knowledge of.
that's not true, Nandini. That's not true. Uh, these children will have to grow up to be that much more sensitive and inclusive in probably thinking about that other perspective so deeply that it reflects in the story. And that might lead to a world where the marginalized don't have issues with their stories being appropriated. I'll try and explain myself. So, in all my stories about the tribal, whether it's the short film Cycle or the novel Unga or some of the short stories in Forgetting or Joram, primarily the narrative of the tribal is that of a survivor, a victim, a, the person violence is perpetrated on. And the tribal has an issue with me, and I've been put in the dock many times, that that is not all that we're about. We're about a whole lot of other things, but all you see is the survivor of violence or the victim of violence. And therefore, you telling that story again and again is perpetuating the cycle in a certain subliminal way. In my defense, I say that, you know what, I agree. And maybe in my lifetime, I might not be able to arrive at the core of the tribal experience to be able to find the narratives that are beyond the survivor narrative and go into the nuances of your daily life in the forest and your history and your culture. Maybe I won't, but please try and understand who I'm making the films for, who I'm writing the books for. I'm writing them and making them for people who don't know you beyond the survivor victim, framework. And the minute I use a familiar framework and sort of reel them in, I can then expand it to include five other things that they knew nothing about. Now, given that this wokeness has only just come, those five other things are also very, very limiting. But when our children grow up, maybe those five things will become 500. So maybe this discourse will not be the same. It will be that much more expansive. what we are struggling with at such a primary level will have probably gone to a slightly more exalted level. So it's important that we grapple with it now, so that our children are grappling with something at a more advanced level and not at such a primitive level of
I understand.
conversation.
I do understand that
But
it's
there's no way of circumventing it, and it's very dangerous to sort of make it a simplistic discussion of, so do we say only what we know and only what we recognize and only what we've lived? No, keep fighting for the right to tell stories that go beyond your experience, but keep trying to be 100 times more sensitive about the people whose stories you're trying to tell.
that I can get on board with. But
Because you cannot escape appropriation. You are doing it whether you like it or not. No matter how well-meaning you are appropriating. No matter how sensitive and well-researched you are never going to know what the experience from the inside out feels like.
absolutely, no, that is for sure. And I do also understand that, and I was having this discussion when I had Yogesh on my show, who's also quite an interesting thinker, and we were talking about wokeness and the fact that we are still at such a nascent state. So our vocabulary around these things is still very awkward, and we make mistakes, and we will continue to make mistakes. But that doesn't
Actually,
mean we stop.
the trap is the wokeness has come because of social media and the online space, and it's therefore trapped us in vocabulary. People are using words like appropriate and
Yes.
woke are just words, and they're very limiting words, and our conversations can go beyond the limitations of these words. It takes me back to language. We
Yeah.
get limited by language. If we can, I mean, I'm hoping that our children then will grow up, grapple with these things, and sort of break out of the limitations of language and start going with instinct and feeling and intent, and maybe those conversations will sort of expand in beyond words.
It's so true because the more important thing, obviously, and it's quite obvious beyond all the social media, whatever, is being what, imbibing wokeness in your lived experience. And I think there's quite a gap sometimes between
Yeah.
what is professed on social media and the way people are living their lives.
Yes.
Um, from that, without a very graceful transition, I want to move to poetry
Oh,
because
I'm sitting under my poetry shelf.
I have read I have read your poems, and I think they're beautiful, and they reveal a very different side of you. So I would love for you to read something for us today if you feel so inclined.
Yeah, that's a rather violent shift. I need 2 minutes to settle because, like I said, this conversation that comes at me all the time. There is no interview, no engagement, no screening Q&A, nothing where I'm exempt from this difficult conversation, because in all my films, I'm
Yeah.
representing a lot of people that I don't belong to. Because like I said, I mean, I have a lot of stories about my relationships and my origins and my culture, which I don't care to tell because it just feels like there's so many more pressing things that need to be spoken about. So I just get my core gets a little rattled by
Yes.
this. Because yes, although I said all the things I said, but it's not easy to reconcile with the fact that the people whose stories I'm trying very hard to represent in my films and books don't want me to do it. So how am I going to find it within myself to be sensitive to all everybody in equal measure and still find the drive to get these stories out? Because truth be told, no one wants these stories out. Producers don't want them out, audiences don't want them out, nobody wants them out because they ask difficult questions. They're not an easy watch, they're not an easy read.
But you want them out.
Yeah, so it boils down to that. Like I said, so once I get into the making of it and the writing of it, I'm not thinking about anybody else. But before I've started making it, and once it's made, I'm at the mercy of everybody else. So it's only during the making of it that I'm not thinking about them, which is a very short span of time. But for the rest of my life, I'll have to engage. I'll have to think about everybody's perspective but mine, because I am not at the center of things. I'm merely the receptacle. I'm merely the channel. So
And of
it's quite
course,
rattling.
and what you said about heightened sensitivity. We must be more aware. These are all absolutely good things. I don't think anyone in their right mind would say that that's not needed. But to scare people off from even attempting a story which is not their own, I think it limits us in ways that is not very helpful.
Nandini, I'm sorry, I'll point something out. When you said it's a choice of words, when you scare people off from telling a story that's not yours, you're putting the onus on the voiceless. They are not scaring us off. It becomes an us and them kind of discourse. We have been too privileged for too long to not be questioned, because that Dalit, that tribal, that LGBTQ person in a country that did not allow gay marriages till until recently was not given that freedom of expression. And suddenly now that person is fighting to be heard and to have their expression acknowledged. So the onus of that cannot be put on them. They have all the right to put us in the dock because we've made them live in the dock for 5,000 years or more. So I think we should also choose what
Hmm.
what angle we are approaching this conversation from. We have to take the onus of this on ourselves and not put the onus on them,
No,
because
I
they
hear you.
are only just coming into their own and they are entitled to it. Because the violence that they have seen, like I had two Dalit friends in my short film team, and often in the meetings, I used to be talking about the tribal situation and almost equating it with the Dalit situation, because I, I safely assumed I was speaking to privileged Brahmin idiots, because that's the majority of people working in the industry. Sometimes I have to forget that there are two Dalits in the room. And this one Dalit friend of mine, who's also a poet, he gently and very lovingly called me out on it a couple of times and said, "You know what, sir, when you talk about this so sweepingly, कि उनके साथ तो ऐसा होता है," he said, "It's अच्छा नहीं लगता है, sir, because you don't know what we've been through. I have seen uh, people in my family, my superiors, I don't know, I forget if it was an uncle or who it was, get stabbed just because he ate where he shouldn't have been eating." So we've seen so much violence from the time we were 4 years old that
Hmm.
we come shaped in very hard ways. So be sensitive to that. I know it's not easy for you to imagine what we've been through, because we are sitting at a table in a coffee shop with you in Bombay speaking your language. So it's very hard to imagine that at the age of 4, I've seen a family member get knifed. But please try and be sensitive to that and don't generalize these conversations. We are not an idea. We are blood and flesh and bone, and we are sitting in front of you. So it just shook me. And so I've been
I can
overtly
imagine.
sensitive ever since. And I acknowledge every individual for the history that that individual comes with. That makes my job infinitely more difficult, but we owe it to them. They don't owe us anything right now.
No, absolutely. And I think there is so much to learn, right? Like at the moment, how you called out the fact that words matter, right? The way
Yeah,
that the way that I would frame something could
yeah.
actually open up new wounds or fresh
Yes,
wounds
yes,
where you're
yes.
actually trying to heal or be part of the sort of
Yeah,
healing
but you're
process,
you're just scratching wounds
but
when
you're
you think you're trying
scratching
to
wounds.
heal. Yeah, yeah,
Lots to learn there.
yeah. It's
Um,
endless. It's endless. It's an abyss. You can keep falling and never hit the bottom.
But the thing is, we will keep making mistakes and we'll keep learning and we'll keep supporting
That's
our
the
own
attitude to
learning in
enter
that.
this discourse with.
Yes.
And it's a very difficult attitude to hold on to every second of your journey, because we
Yes,
are
of
human.
course.
Yeah, we have to remind ourselves every minute in every interaction with every sentence that this is the intent.
And that is also, it's a responsibility, right, that you take on.
Insane amount.
If you're choosing to do what you're doing, that
Yeah.
is the responsibility that comes with the turf. One final quick question about audiences. Since you were recently in Australia and you've been traveling with your film to all these different
Mm.
countries, um, do you find the audiences in the diaspora, in the Indian diaspora, when you've had a chance to interact, are quite open to your stories? Is it a little bit different in how they receive them? I know it's a very broad sort of a question, but what has been your recent experience, for instance, in the film festivals and with the people who've watched your film?
The people in the diaspora, again, it might come off as a slightly generalized, sweeping kind of response. But the small set of the people in the diaspora that I interacted with are really people who seek out a film like Joram at a festival, because Joram, when you read a catalog or you read a one-liner or you read a review, it makes no bones about what its politics is. So someone who doesn't agree with me will actually not land up in the hall. But broadly, I have seen that in the diaspora, most of the Indians today believe that Modi is good for India. And they are very smug and comfortable in their ignorance of the ground realities, because the ground realities don't even make it to the Indian media. Forget, transcending national boundaries, because foreign media from BBC to Al Jazeera, they've pretty much been uh, blocked from this country. If they are trying to get some word out from the inside, it's in subversive ways, because foreign media is not allowed free access to what's actually happening. So in Edinburgh, in fact, in my first screening, there was a gentleman, he was over 60. And after the film ended and the Q&A began, and I was asked about how the situation is in India on the grassroots. And because I have made a film like this, I take it upon myself to be a political ambassador. And I'm not going to pull my punches standing in an Edinburgh or a Sydney. And the festivals that have curated the films are actually, they have been incredible with the love and the support and the freedom and the nurturing that they give a voice like mine. But this gentleman, an Indian who's first generation diaspora, his hands were trembling with rage, and he took the mic and he said, "How dare you present only this perspective of India to the world when India is doing well on so many counts?" And he just tore into me, and half the Q&A then went in me having to react to his accusations. So I don't know, it's very polarizing, but the people who have seeked my film out are people who are very, very cognizant and empathetic, and their hearts bleed for, I think, quite like what NRI Affairs and you guys are doing, are actively trying to do what you can from a distance. But the majority of Indians living abroad, I'd request all of them, if anybody accidentally watches this interview, to take the first flight here and join me on a trip into the heartland and see if they want to hold on to that same perspective.
There's too much to say about that, because we are seeing so much of that, the same kind of the polarization spill over into communities here.
I'm sure.
So it's heartbreaking, but yes, there is resistance in whatever way, shape, or form,
Yes.
or scale. But there are voices that are being very brave in this environment to actually do what they can and speak where they can.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of work happening, but I do hear you. It is quite a reality of at least the diaspora that I'm seeing here.
If you
Um,
can photo up my poetry now, if you'd like me to, then I can only then read out a political poem, because I think the mood from love and death and sex has shifted. We are firmly on politics. And these are my four pet, actually, themes when I write poetry, or when I'm given the freedom to write what I want to write. It's love, death, sex, and politics in that order. But somehow political films get made, and the love, sex, and death films have not gotten made yet.
that itself sounds like a poem or a start of a poem. But I'll let you choose whatever you feel. I'm happy to hear any one of them.
Then we'll do the political poem. Maybe after that, if you still have the stamina, I'll read a smaller something else out.
Perfect.
So this is a poem I wrote. It's in fact, sadly, the last poem I ever wrote. I have not written a poem in the last 4 years, because there's just been so much rage inside, and the kind of films I make, like I said, most of my energy goes in just bringing myself to the point where I start to make the film. So there's no energy left to write poems. But somehow this poem, I didn't know when I wrote this in 2019 that I'd never write a poem after this one. And the poem's called There Are No Poems. So I'll read There Are No Poems. There are no poems for the mother who didn't have her stomach sutured after they extracted her unborn tumor, afraid she would birth yet another girl, yet another fragile small mouth filled with 1,000 sharp edged questions that might erupt like puzzle saplings through the blood soaked earth, quite like the three who came before her and now lie rotting in the same masculine mud. There are no poems for that girl who, if she had lived to crawl, to utter, would have whiplashed endless whys with a furious, tongueless mouth, her circumcised soul the size of a curse that a species cannot endure. There are no poems about the slithering fear they carry coiled inside their military hearts. Fear with forked tongues, forked as forceps, that extract any and all future whys that may dare to doubt the absence of poems in this land. There are poems, though, written in prisons about good men in cages, quietly living out unjust sentences, as if forbearance were man's greatest virtue. No matter how many others beyond those cages, imprisoned in their skins, whose shades start wars, were mere inconveniences made to snag on battle tank chains, torn to abstractions, their histories littering the gutters outside those prison walls like the shadows of untrod snakes. There are no poems, though, about those men who chose instead to blow up prison walls. Poems, although much longer, are wishless before bullets. A poem may pierce but cannot kill. Poems can stand silently like rifles in corners, like their shadows, like their cold, long iron penises, which spray angry hate into the women they kill when their bullets run out, like the dead wood in their butts that once throbbed with moss and arched to greet the first rain, but have now been polished to a place where no trace of life can taint them. Poems can stand silently, but do not wish to. My poem would like to greet you the way a furious matchstick greets a river of oil. There are no poems for fire started this way. But if there happen to be one or two, they will have leapt into their own fires, unwilling to outlast them. There are no poems that stand as shrines to the self emulated. Words dream of being embers, not ash. I carry your poem in my hand. It was carved here like a road. It was to take us somewhere. I carry your poem on my shoulders like a father would have that little girl had she been birthed. I carry your poem around my neck. My chest is words read by those who understand my tongue. I met one who didn't. She stared at me with fear. Our skins were not the same shade. I felt the urge to reach for a knife then, since she would never allow me to kill her with your poem. There was a poem I wrote once that stood defiant before an atomic sorrow. I waited for one of the two to explode, hoping to go down with it. But instead, yet another unsuspecting geographical boundary somewhere shivered and changed shape, like a nervous tongue begging allegiance of a new anthem, including a new poem on one side, excluding a familiar one on the other. There are no poems for those who cease to belong when boundaries change this way. Yeah, that was it. That was the last poem I ever wrote.
Take back everything you said about language being all sorts of things.
Yeah, but what do I do with this poem in front of someone who doesn't know English?
It's a gorgeous poem, you know that.
Thank you.
Are you going to read another one?
Given the kind of, the kind of, lack of a better word, society India is, there's a, there's a lot of, in terms of my storytelling, there's a lot that I'd like to explore sexually. But given how difficult it is to get people to back such a film or even watch such a film, I ended up actually exploring a lot of those themes and ideas in my poetry. And now that I don't write poetry, I actually miss that the most, because that's something in India, in my current lifetime, I will not be able to explore the way I want to, the way I see it explored in the South American cinema, in the Spanish cinema, in the Italian cinema, with a certain abandon, with a certain complete absence of judgment, to go beyond the understood limitations of fidelity and morality and religion and cultural fetters. I don't think we can do that. I can't do that in this country. So if I ever go back to poetry, it will be to explore those ideas. So I'll read a poem that was written around one of these feelings, and it's called Mud. She asked if she could plant herself on me. She had dreamt of mangoes the night before and asked me to Google what that meant. The fruit of my labor came organically. Sexual, said Google. Her hair hung like 100 roots searching my skin for a trace of an aquifer. Wet, she'd said in a chat message when I'd asked her how she'd been. Reaching for the sky could take 70 years if you are a tree. The rest of us find our clouds underneath our eyelids as we shudder into fistfuls of mud.
It's a gorgeous poem. I remember this one.
Yeah, this published.
From my point of view, I think you should write lots more poems if your filmmaking gives you a break.
Yeah, as long as this government's around, there's going to be no poetry coming out of me.
Gosh, then there's more reason to wish for what we all wish for.
Yes.
And with that, thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us so much of your time. I know you've been super busy, but we absolutely appreciate it. And it was just such an unexpected experience to actually get to watch your film in Sydney. And I hope you'll be back soon.
Yes, thank you.